Okay.
Because I thought.
Is it you?
Is it me? Is that clear what you're gonna tell Janet now? It's kind of like our meeting with Alcorn.
I'll just have to go back there and look at the trays. I couldn't, Jen and I were talking about that earlier, about
We won't
which
say
ones
that.
are here, which ones aren't.
The only way I can tell is that I look at because the tray, I thought the trays were different, but the trays don't look all that different. They just look on the bottom, but I've never looked at the bottom, I only look at that top, and usually you only need one.
Yeah.
And it's very easy to see the one of them that is used all the time. So,
Really, when it comes
Yeah.
down to the big issues, I don't ask
but it's time consuming if you have a lot.
So,
Yeah.
it's.
That's why
Yeah, basically saying that the
I don't know.
confusion.
We may need to readjust.
Yeah, it's not necessarily like they're forced to be the saints, but it's prayer between the saints.
Maybe not.
I mean, I'm sure with this Palm Sunday and Easter Sunday, we're gonna need more than usual.
Yeah.
Probably depends,
But
yeah.
what Alan Danielson told me was 2 trays for the 8 o'clock service, or 1.5. But he would rather have, when he is usher, I always put, or elder, I put 2 trays and for first service.
Yeah.
And 3 trays for second service, because he gets really nervous.
Well, there's been times I've had to move the cups around,
Yeah.
because you end up with maybe 5 cups in one tray and 6 in the other.
Well, that's, yeah.
All right, we are at Romans 13.
Okay, everybody was here, so I don't need to give anybody this.
Let us pray. Heavenly Father, we give you thanks for this day. Be with us as we explore your word, especially as we continue through the book of Romans. May it be a light for our path, a lamp for our feet. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. All right. Who wants to read Romans 13? It's only 14 verses.
Doug? No.
Okay. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist unfair judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? And do what is good, and you will receive his approval. He is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is a servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this, you also pay taxes. For the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, and honor to whom honor is owed. Owe no one anything except to love each other, for the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment are summed up in this word: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfilling of the law. Besides this, you know the time, that the hour has come for you to wake up from sleep, for salvation is nearer to us now than when we first believed. The night is far gone, the day is at hand. So then let us cast off the works of darkness and put on the armor of light. Let us walk properly as in the daytime, not in orgies and drunkenness, not in sexual immorality and sensuality, not in quarreling and jealousy, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh to gratify its desires.
All right. Any opening questions on Romans chapter 13? Do
just goes along with the fourth commandment.
It really does, right? It goes along with the fourth commandment. You could say it's a treatise on the fourth commandment. Remember, so he spent most of Romans. Everybody's guilty of sin. We're all saved by faith. He's dealt with the scandal of particularity, and that we are brought into one body under Christ. To what that means for those in the upper echelon, or to associate with the lower echelon, and society, things like that. Like Christ breaks down barriers, and so there is one body in Jesus Christ that is the church. And kind of going through this implication of sinner, justified. Okay, so what's it look like in our civil life or civic life? And in particular, Romans chapter 13. What does it look like for a Christian to be a part of a nation, of a state? Right? In other words, citizen, the vocation of citizenship. Now, this is written in the, what do we say, 57 AD, I believe? So 57 AD, so the major persecution under Nero has not broken out. Paul would be, Paul and Peter would die within 5 years of this book being written. But there had been persecution, and there was persecution. Christianity was illegal. Persecution was primarily not empire-wide, but certain locales, different governors, different regional people in charge would be more tolerant or less tolerant, whether they care or not about the religious functions of the state. There was a religious function in the Roman state. This is why certain religions were legal and certain religions were not legal. So, and this would function through this idea that religion is tied to the state is very universal. And it is not until the Enlightenment in the 1700s where there is a proposed separation between church and state. How that looks like in our Constitution is the First Amendment, the free exercise of religion, where the government cannot establish a church, or and commonly also understood to be promoting a church or a religion, a certain religion. The exact phrase, a separation of church and state, comes from the Federalist Papers, which many legal scholars like to point out is not part of the Constitution, yet it weighs heavily in court decisions because the Federalist Papers were basically commentary on how to understand how the Constitution and the amendments were to function once they were ratified. So,
well, they were in support of the.
They were, and so people had, right? So people had questions. Okay, what's this Constitution gonna mean? What are these amendment means? Things like this. And so those who helped to write the Constitution, so Alexander Hamilton, things like that, he wrote the majority of the Federalist Papers, wrote these Federalist Papers as an explanation of how this is supposed to be interpreted. So this is kind of why I've never seen a lawyer, except very rarely, will sit there and say, well, church and state isn't in the Constitution. And it's because, well, our legal theory understands kind of the purpose of the Federalist Papers, why they're not legal documents, and that has factored into legal decisions in the history of our country.
Which is true. You don't hear a lawyer say that, but you will at times hear a lawyer say, the Federalist Papers were written by supporters of the Constitution, not to say that there's not another side. There's another side.
There is another
the
side.
Anti-Federalists
Right.
also had
Yep.
had
Right.
papers that they wrote And some
Yeah.
of them were in the government at the time.
They were, yes.
So,
right.
it's a,
Piece of tape
it's
is
a,
bothering
it's a
me. Put that there.
touchy
It is,
subject.
it is. But I just bring that up to sit there and say that how we exercise our faith and how we view government in faith is through the prism of the Enlightenment, which is why you don't kind of see this mentality in non-Western countries. So, for example, Iraq, Afghanistan, now Syria, in their constitutions, Islam is the official religion of the state. And for Afghanistan, for example, I know you have to be Muslim to hold political office. I don't know if it's local office or just federal offices in Afghanistan's constitution, but you have to be a Muslim to hold legal office. And we sit there and say, well, that, whatever. But the Muslim world didn't go through the Enlightenment. In many, many ways, right now, and over the past, maybe since the 1930s, 1940s, Muslim countries are going through kind of a sort of enlightenment thing, and that is a process. And this is why, like, Morocco is much more tolerant, has kind of what we might call Western values with things, women can drive, they don't have to wear the hijab, hijabi, whatever it's called, things like that, as opposed to like Saudi Arabia or Iran. I think Iran just hung a 16-year-old girl for getting a driver's license like last week, right? So, and also in like more, like China, things like that, you don't see necessarily a separation of church and state. And some of you might sit there and say, well, China is communist, they're atheists, they don't have a church. China legally enforces atheism. Atheism is a part of communism, and enforce it in such a way that you can very much make an argument that it is a religion, right? Now they do allow some legalized Christianity, but they do also frequently persecute it. It goes under waves. When they feel like culture is becoming too open to the West, and so I think it was about 10 years ago or so, China did have a big crackdown on Christians and made churches remove crosses, especially crosses on the outside of buildings. China regularly and has been the Uyghur Muslims committing a genocide basically on them because they see Islam as a threat to the Communist Party. And so this idea of separation of church and state is, we have to realize in our American context, you're not going to necessarily read that in Scripture anywhere.
It was an important issue at the time of the writing of the Constitution
Yeah.
because you had all these colonies that actually had
Official religions.
official religions.
And they were enforced to greater or lesser extent.
Yeah, right.
I heard recently though, in the well settled and populated parts of the colonies at the time of the American Revolution, what was the percentage of the population that went to church on a weekly basis? 17%. 17%. A lot of people like to point out, America is a Christian country. They'll say that 20% of the population is in church on Sunday. If 20% was in church on Sunday, you wouldn't be able to drive anywhere Sunday morning. The roads would be full. Like, honestly. So it's always been people who actually, what happens is a lot of these studies, and what you have to separate out is those who self-identify versus studies that actually look more towards churches that report attendance and extrapolate off of that. Because the more accurate one are the churches that actually report attendance. For example, Pew Religious Survey came out a couple weeks ago. And there was some pretty alarming, eyebrow raising, whatever adjective finding you want to put on that. Over, I mean, some of the core doctrines that the LCMS upholds doctrinally, over half the church body opposed, right? And you start breaking down the numbers. Well, if somebody was baptized LCMS and never went to church again, they were counted as LCMS. The Pew Research Survey had our population as a church body between 3 and 3.5 million people. We have 1.8 million people, of roughly which on a given Sunday, 800,000 are in church. And as a church body across the nation, we are 1%, basically, we round out about 1% of the total population of the United States.
Is it because the younger people are not going to church, or?
For the Pew Research, it was just bad methodology. They let people self-identify, and they asked questions of like, what church were you baptized in? You know, and again, it was like, if you hadn't attended in 25 years, they would still count you as a member of that church, right? So, when studies are adjusted to say, okay, this is what self-identified is. This is, 4 times a year attendance, 8 times a year attendance, monthly attendance, every other week attendance, weekly attendance. What you see is cultural values, church doctrine values. And it's almost perfectly reflective. So, there's always been, there's who are the least divorced population of America? Weekly service attenders. Across religions, weekly service attenders. Now, the question then becomes, is that because they are weekly service attenders and so those religions are promote family, discourage things like divorce, things like that? Or is it they're less likely to be divorced because they're weekly service centers, right? Like, is one causing the other? Basically, where's the causation of that? And there's no study to kind of point that out. And so all we know is that there's a correlation between people who go to church every week and low divorce rates, low abuse rates, right? Doesn't say that divorce and abuse doesn't happen, things like that. It still does, but it's lower. In the same way as people who go to religious services weekly, less likely to be involved in crime. Right? Does that mean that everybody's not involved in crime that goes to church every week? No. So it's just kind of some of those numbers that we see. So there was a lot of people freaking out about it, and then you actually got to the metrics and the methodologies and stuff, and it's a completely useless survey.
Pastor?
Yes?
People who go to church have a sense of accountability, I think.
Yeah. Well, see, so that's the question, right? Is it does the church instill that accountability, or do they have that accountability and so they go to church? Which comes first, the chicken or the egg? That's the debate when it comes to this kind of stuff. So when we see the correlations, the question is then the causation, and we don't know, quite frankly. We don't know the causations. And so it's always the chicken and egg debate. By the way, the chicken did come first. Chicken lays the eggs. So there's not in the Roman world, there's not a separation of church and state. There are a few legalized religions. Stoicism is one of them. Stoicism is really big in the army. There's some of the most famous philosophers from this age, from antiquity, are Stoics, right? And you would probably read a Stoic and find a lot of things you agree with. They're big on virtues. These virtues tend to be universal virtues. Courage,
Following the rules.
following the rules, things like that. I don't think Manichaeism is on yet. Judaism becomes a legalized religion because Jews keep on revolting and fighting the Romans and refusing to worship the Roman gods. It's very perplexing to the Romans, by the way. Every group that conquers the Jews are just absolutely baffled by these people. Like, you lost, accept our gods, and the Israelites are like, no, kill us. We don't care, right? And even the worst of the worst of the worst people, even back then, don't regularly want to engage in genocide. It takes a very select person to sit there and say, well, genocide's the answer. Let's just kill them all. And you're talking about cultures and values and societies that devalue human life by and large. So there's the Roman pantheon of gods. Okay, so the relation of the Roman ideology, Roman pantheon of gods to Greek ideology and Greek ideology of gods, they're built upon one another. They're very, very similar. As one philosophy professor put it when I was in college, it's kind of like the difference between America and Britain, in that they're very, very similar, right? But if you ask an American, would you rather be an American or a British person? The American would be like, it's great over Britain, but it's better to be American, right? So very, very similar, but one's built upon the other. So, and in the worldview of Rome, their mandate, their ethos as a nation, what combines them together as an empire, whether this is true or not, but what they indoctrinate their people on, is that they are put in place by the gods to bring order to the world. And what is order to the world? Roman society. So those who do not fit into Roman legal society, aka you're worshiping a non-legal religion, are literally a threat to the entire Roman Empire if you're in the empire. If you're out the empire, worship whatever you want, right? But if you're in the empire, you have to worship, especially if you're a Roman citizen, you have to worship what is legally available to worship. Otherwise, you threaten all the empire, and the gods might get mad at Rome, and they'll go and they'll lose a battle or something like that. And Rome is very, very big about not losing face. That gets baked into very, very early on in the Roman Empire at the highest of levels. Very, very big of not losing face. So things like honor and dignity. And so if you threaten that, they're going to kill you. They might, a governor that's a little bit more lax might just whip you or imprison you, but eventually they will kill you. And this is what happens to the Christians. This is happening periodically to the Christians. Christ is crucified roughly 33 AD. This is 24 years later. There have been bouts of Christians being killed by the Roman government. Crucified, scourged, just slaughtered, arrested, beaten. As bad as our prisons are today, you don't want to go to a Roman prison, all right? Unless you have a lot of money and a lot of powerful friends. And so, what does it mean to be a Christian and live in the Roman Empire in the heart of Rome? Let every person be subject to the governing authorities. There is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Now, where we sit, post-Enlightenment, that's a radical statement. This is probably the least radical thing in the book of Romans. This is like everything else has been upheaval. Okay, the rich are supposed to hang out with the poor, and men are supposed to treat women rightly, and women are supposed to treat men rightly, and masters are supposed to be nice to slaves, and slaves are supposed to joyfully serve their masters, and they're all equal in the sight of God. everything is chaos. And then Paul comes up, yeah, except for government, all right? That just happens as it's always happened, okay? Like, this is the most normal thing for a Roman to hear right now. Everything is from God. Give honor and authority. But it is a question in the church because there is a thought of, should we rebel against this demonic government? I mean, that's what was happening in Jerusalem, right? Barabbas led a revolt, okay? There's Simon well, there's a few Simons. There's zealots, right? The zealots were people that if you ever lived in Michigan, you would understand this reference. They were the militia. They were ready to go and start a war against the Romans. They had a jeep full of guns and 3 years of dried food in their basement, ready to fight it out to the death. Right? And so obviously the government was also pagan, right? That's why the Jews, the ancient Israelites, kept on revolting. We can't have this Roman government over us. We can't have the Roman standard on the outside of the temple. They tried to put it inside the temple, right? I think it's later. Yeah, it's 70 AD, where the temple is destroyed. And the reason the temple is destroyed is because there was a revolt that happened in the late 60s. And Rome finally has enough. They level Jerusalem, right? They change the landscape of Jerusalem. Jerusalem was built on cliffs. They built an earthen ramp up the back side where the wall was lowest. Imagine being so mad, you come up to a cliff and you say, okay, this is how we're going to deal with these people. Okay, we can go through the front door, or we're just going to need a metric ton, figuratively. We're going to build an earthen ramp so we can just smash our army in their back wall. And it's going to take a while to build that ramp. And, of course, they're going to be throwing stones and all sorts of stuff at you at the same time. That's how hacked off Rome was. And so this question of how does the Christian relate to government is an ancient question. This is why Paul is addressing it. Origen also cautions those in authority. This is what he says on verse 1. What does Paul mean when he says there is no authority except from God? Is an authority which persecutes the children of God, which attacks the faith, and which undermines our religion from God. We shall answer this briefly. Nobody will deny that our senses, sight, sound, and thought, are given to us by God. But although we get them from God, what we do with them is up to us. God will judge us righteously for having abused what he gave us to use for good. Likewise, God's judgment against the authorities will be just, if they have used the powers they have received according to their own ungodliness and not according to the laws of God. Origen lives before Christianity becomes a legalized religion in the Roman Empire. I'm going to say he's around 130 AD. Could be wrong on that. And so what he's saying is okay, we know that the government's ungodly, but God will judge them in the end. And that's what it boils down to. So how do Christians live with an ungodly government? One is you do try to change it, if that's available, right? And as there was more Christians, and as some of those Christians became senators and things like that, the government did change. Finally, Constantine wins the emperorship. He legalizes Christianity. It doesn't become the religion of the empire until after he's dead, I believe. He just legalizes it. And then, but there's no command from God in the scriptures to overthrow an ungodly government, because that ungodly government will bring God's wrath upon itself for being ungodly. Which, as a freedom-loving 1776 American, makes me have great pause, because I'm like, but fireworks and 4th of July and let freedom ring and tyranny, right?
Revolt.
Yeah, revolt. Apollinarius of Laodicea says this about revolt. Judas the Galilean revolted in the days of the census, says Gamaliel of the Acts of the Apostles, and drew away some of the people after him, refusing to obey the order of the Romans and register their goods, for which reason Quirinius had been sent to Syria. He's the governor mentioned in Luke 2. But as Judas's decision was the cause of domestic murders and of a rebellion against the authorities, which did much harm to the people, it seems to me that here the apostle is condemning any attempt to imitate him based on the illusion that it is a godly thing to disobey rulers. He has a good deal to say about this, condemning it as a mistaken way of thinking. And that's from the Pauline commentary from the Greek Church, which is an amalgamation of Eastern Church Fathers. So, there is a church father saying, Paul's explicitly saying you don't have a theological reason to rebel. Now, again, go ahead. I struggle with this too, so go ahead.
You don't have a legal responsibility to rebel.
Yeah.
Or, you don't have a legal reason to rebel, but you also do not have a reason to follow anything that government tells you to do that is in direct conflict with.
Correct.
And so
So this is
the idea is like the same as with a family and the government. So
Yes.
your father tells you to do something, you do it, even if you don't want to do it. But you do it because your father tells you to do it. But if
Yep.
your father tells you to do something that is against God's command, then you don't do it.
Right.
And it's the same way with government.
So this is the struggle. So this is one of the most recent and most famous examples that comes to mind is Bonhoeffer, Nazi Germany. He is a part of the plot, and a very high part of the plot to kill Hitler, the failed assassination attempt of the bomb, where Hitler was saved by a heavy table and basically a guy standing in front of him at the wrong moment for the rest of the world. Good moment for Hitler. And Bonhoeffer famously never gives a theological justification. What he comes to is a moral implication that it is worse to be silent and stand by and to let this murderous dictator stay in power, but he cannot give a God-ordained theological position, right?
God didn't come to him and say, you kill Hitler.
Right? Yeah.
Because
So-
vengeance is mine, says the Lord.
Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, right?
So there are consequences when you do things like that, from the governing authorities, but even from God too, if you
Yes.
are to do.
Yeah. And then the question that really makes it messy is, as we try to figure this out, is, okay, does that mean that the United States is an illegitimate country because it was founded off a rebellion? Or has God, since it is a country, a nation, a functioning government, has God ordained it? And this is something that theologians that have had a little bit too much brandy and cigars like to argue about, and I'm just like, yeah, no. It's just going to make your head hurt because you're not going to come to an answer. Now, people have different things that they are passionate about, things like that. Notably here, verse 2, therefore whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. And so then the question is, okay, so what is resisting authority? Is that armed rebellion? Because that seems to be what Paul is talking about here, armed rebellion. And answer, because again, we don't have to go that far into history. 1960s, civil disobedience, the civil rights movement, right? There were riots. There were bad things. But there's also the sit-ins, the the bus boycott, right? Where people use nonviolent ways to resist the government and an unfair, immoral practices of said government. My understanding of Romans is that armed rebellion is wrong. But what we would call civil disobedience is perfectly within the purview of the Christian church.
Well, and you go back to David, or Daniel in the lion's den, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
Yep.
They were up in the government, they
Yep.
did what the government told them to do.
But they had a hard line.
But they had a hard, yeah,
Right.
and they ended up, when the government specifically told them to, you have to stop this,
They weren't going to stop.
they weren't gonna stop.
And I can't remember which of the three was Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I think it's Shadrach that speaks up and says, "You can kill us. Our God can protect us. You know, there's nothing you can do that our God basically can't protect us from. And even if He doesn't, even if He lets us die, it's still wrong to worship You and to worship this idol, and we won't do it." You know. Really good statement of faith, but you know, that's obviously there was civil disobedience that happened there, right? And it's when the government sits there and says you have to abandon the faith. Okay, at that point, no, we're not gonna obey. This is still this is not a settled question. Anybody that can remember, I know it's ancient history, but anybody that can remember 5 years ago, this was the debate. Because you had states like Oklahoma, which remained open and allowed churches to meet. And you had states like California and New York that said churches cannot meet. And the issue in California was, well, people could still go to bars. It's like, why do nightclubs have more rights than a church? And so how was the church to respond to that, especially, and what factors into this is also understanding historically, the church has, in times of plague, held off for a while from gathering. Right? And so that was part of it. Most recently, before that was about 100 years before, with the flu pandemic, influenza pandemic. And that in 1912, I think it was, something like that. There was like a 3-month time where the LCMS was telling churches to not gather in person, to obey the government, that this is fine, that this has happened historically, and it's only a pause. Now, trying to say that same message in 2020 radicalized some people. Some people are saying that the church abandoned its people, that the church, the denomination, abandoned local congregations. And that's something I think that we will discuss. I think that at a certain point, forgiveness just needs to be given on both sides, because the other thing is again, it was state by state. It wasn't a federal mandate anywhere. It was state by state. And especially very early on, I mean, we were reading in newspapers how Italy was 2 days away from implementing triage precautions, which would only be, if you're going to live, we will treat you, and everybody else, you stay home and die. The death rate among Italy was 20% of those that contracted COVID. Now, we're able to remove from that situation, realize Italy had an aging population, which contributed to that. The death rate in America was still 10 times that of the normal yearly flu, which is 10 to 30,000 on average. A bad year of the flu is 50,000 people. Right? COVID was over 1 million within a year. So these are debates that still happen because we must obey God rather than men, but Peter is speaking to priests. And that's an important distinction there. He's speaking to the priests. He's not speaking to the Roman governor. And here, obey the government. Whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed. And so, Scripture doesn't exist in a vacuum. Scripture interprets Scripture. How do we understand this? And people fell on different sides of that line and that argument. And where I sit today, I have my opinions. I believe what our church did was right. We also had potentially black mold in our events, so you were going to get sick one way or another if we had church. They could have come down and done a testing for black mold and shut us down. The health department could have done that, and that would have been completely legal for them to do. That's the job of the health department, right? So we were shut down, not so much because of COVID, but because it was COVID and black mold that was going on in our building. Which makes me feel really good, every Sunday that I was here. But anyway, the sides calcified, propaganda got involved, it became political, which means it became tribal, and there are still those very, very angry with the church today, causing much grief to the church. And there are those who are very, very angry with those who wanted to stay wide open and just whoever dies, dies. And those two people are still arguing today over that. And I pray that they will be reconciled.
They'll do that until the next pandemic,
Hopefully not in my lifetime,
Yeah, mine.
quite honestly. I really hope that, I pray, obviously, for peace in my day, but I want peace in my kids' day as well. I pray that future generations learn from the mistakes that happened with us. They don't get in the mindset of, it won't ever happen again. And that they wrestle with this issue and they give each other grace if and when it happens. That is my prayer. Because we were not ready as a society, as a country, and as a church. If you look at the TLH hymn, prayers, and if you look at the prayers in LSB, you will find many more prayers in the Lutheran hymnal dealing with affliction than you will with the LSB. And I think that's because there was a big difference between the 1940s and, it was published in 2006. I think they started compiling it together in 1997, 98, something like that. That 50-ish years, almost 60 years, our society was basically, we're invincible. We've conquered disease. We've conquered unsettling government and all that stuff. We're not going to have another World War or anything close to that, right? Communism had fallen. We were out of the Cold War. And that mindset, we weren't aware of that, directly gets put into the LSB, so that when something happened, we didn't have the language to deal with it as a church body. And because we didn't, as a church body, it was hard to give individual Christians that language as well. That's my 2 cents. Hopefully we can get past verse 2. It's 45 minutes into the class. The rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. But you have no fear of the one who is in authority. Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. All right, so basically, the Roman government was there to punish wrongdoers. By and large, the government exists to punish wrongdoers. Why we have laws and ordinances and things like that. so that when people break them, we can address the situation, we can, either, whether it's an individual or if it's an organization, like, you know, a builder's not building up the building code, right? We have remedy to fix the situation.
But Rome was doing lots of good things for all the people too. They had an excellent mail system, excellent roads.
Yeah.
They had a good water system.
Yeah, they had it.
They were taking care of the people.
They were, right? They were. I mean, and every society has its problems, right? And so, right, this kind of goes back, as far as it be with you, live at peace with everyone, which was in chapter 12, right? So, hey, listen, obey the law. Obviously not the law that says you have to not be a Christian, but, you know, don't be committing crimes, don't be a terror to your neighbors, you know, anything like that. Yeah, just kind of basic stuff there. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. So, the government rightly punishes people that break the law. Right? And, you know, in Rome, they had their ways of doing that, and the people didn't necessarily have a say on that. Here we affect laws by voting in people. We have a constitutional democratic republic as a form of government, and so we can adjust laws. We have a voice in adjusting laws, things like that. And because of that, nobody ever agrees. Right? You want to make something more lenient, you want to make something more stringent, people are going to argue. But the government is given the sword, and that's an important point. So, where this verse really comes into play is the question of the death penalty. Can the government legally put people to death? Yes. Can the government choose to not allow capital punishment? Yes, it can. It does not have to put people to death. So I have seen Christians argue, no, the government must have the death penalty because of Romans 13, verse 4. But that's not what that verse is saying. Right? The verse is not saying that the government has to have a death penalty. So, can Christians agree on whether to have a death penalty, yes or no? They can. Does this mean that we as a church body can tell the government it should not have the death penalty? No, we can't say that. As individuals you can. But as a church body, we are bound by Scripture, which means that as a church body, we can't sit there and say, well, it is against God to have the death penalty. We can say, hey, listen, we think it's probably not good, but we're not going to do that as a church body, because we're not going to be able to go to a theological position to justify that, honestly. So, the government can put people in prison. It can execute them if need be. It can fine them. Those are all legal. Doug?
God uses human agents to punish evildoers. Genesis 9, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image.
Yep.
So God gives the governing authorities that. If there's no deterrent to crime, people are going to crime.
Right. Right.
There has to be a deterrent. There's got
So
to be.
the argument
There's got to be a curve.
is what should the deterrent be?
Yeah.
Right? That's the argument, and that's what people argue over.
Was very strict.
Yeah.
I mean, they made an example of those people that were evildoers or doing wrong because they wanted to control the people. If you have a terrible punishment for those evildoers, you're less apt to do evil.
Pastor, what if a government has evil, like Hitler? I mean,
Right. So that's the question.
There was a lot of governments that have evil.
well, yeah, but I'm just
Yeah.
using the.
So the reason why the Nazis are so abhorrent to our sensibilities is because Western culture had gotten to the point of finding genocide distasteful, and when, like especially in the Nuremberg trials, concentration camps, when it wasn't just armies fighting and people dying, but it was an intentional eugenics movement to eradicate whole peoples groups. So there were 6 million Jewish people who were killed in the Holocaust. There were hundreds of thousands, possibly in the low millions, of faithful Christians. Poland had much of its population wiped out because Germans hated Poles. Slovaks, they hated Slavs. And this is why Adolf Hitler hyphenates Czechoslovakia. He frickin' hates Slavs. They see them as subhuman. So there's millions of Poles who are genocided. Romani, or gypsies, are genocided. And then, anybody with a mental disability and many people with physical disabilities are also genocided. And when the West sees the horror of this publicly, right, because leaders knew that it was happening and they were doing what they could, but they were fighting a war effort. When this becomes public, Western sensibilities had come to a point of saying, this can never happen again.
But it happens, I mean, it's happening in Africa now and the Middle East.
Well, and you might want to put a little asterisk on this can never happen again. Right? Primarily, how that has been practiced, it's kind of like our original Constitution. It is based upon the idea that all men are created equal, which is the Declaration of Independence. We the people. But then who is defined as a person in the original Constitution?
Landowners.
Whites.
White
Whites.
Males.
The
Male.
white male landowners could vote, but people were whites. Native Americans were not citizens. Black people were not people. They counted as 3/5 of a person, right? We fight a war over this. There are acts and amendments that get passed as what happens is Americans look at this document, look at the government, the society, and the culture that they live in and say, these two things are not the same. And so to live up to our ideals, we need to address these issues. So Native Americans become citizens. Is it the 14th Amendment, birthright citizenship, so to speak? Which, by the way, just commentary, if they end birthright citizenship, that means only people who are naturalized citizens are citizens. I didn't take a test to become a citizen. I was born a citizen. I'm a birthright citizen. I'm very confused with that argument. Off my soapbox there. Which deals with, so that amendment passes to deal with African Americans, slaves in the South that are free, and say, these are United States citizens and they will be granted every right to be a United States citizen. What happens is there's a child born of Chinese immigrants that's working on the Union Pacific Railroad coming east. Is that an American citizen? And that goes all the way to the Supreme Court, right? So I say all that to sit there and say, by the 1940s, after living through the horrors of also World War I, and the European powers, or the Western world, if you will, the Western world, which is the United States and Canada, European powers, right? Never again primarily means white people in Europe. And not to sound racist, and that's going to come across as racist, and there's going to be the implication of racism there and things like that. There is genocide happening in other parts of the world. We allowed Japan to basically ignore the genocide that they perpetuated in Manchuria, China, and on the Koreans during World War II, which is almost as bad or worse than what the Nazis did. But the Nazis are Europeans. The Japanese are not. What's happening in Africa right now, well, it's far away and it's not Europeans. This is something that Christians wrestle with, and this is something of where the debate of is America the world's police comes from Christian ideology of saying if I have the power to stop evil, then God is telling me I should stop that evil.
Yeah, but
As-
we don't hold up to any of that. I mean, 'cause look
Well,
at
we're
our
sinners.
abortion laws.
We're
Is that not
sinners.
the greatest genocide ever?
Which one? The
Abortion.
we are sinners. We are sinners, right? And so that yeah, yeah, it is. 50 million Americans,
Yeah.
right? You would have thought that the Nazis' reaction to Nazism would have killed the eugenics movement. It just found different ways. Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, hated poor people and black people and founded Planned Parenthood as a eugenics movement to start reducing the number of poor people and black people. We have her personal writings saying if we can convince black preachers that this will lead to prosperity, they will promote abortion in their churches.
Why hasn't that spread out that everybody in the country knows that that woman was a bigot?
Because they have a very powerful propaganda media arm. And so we, as a nation, oppose Nazism. But we have to take on an ally as the USSR and Soviet Russia. We don't like the communists. We fight communism around the world in the preceding decades. The whole reason we get into a shooting war in Vietnam is because of communism. And to stop and limit the spread of communism and fight it over there instead of letting it come to our shores. We fight every war to have it over there so it doesn't come here. This is geopolitical
Protected by the
politics.
ocean.
We are protected by an ocean, but our geopolitical politics, in a nutshell, is it is better to fight it over there because less American citizens will die.
Right.
So we will bomb to whatever over there so that we're not having to drop bombs here. But
Stalin and Hitler,
so Stalin actually
And
kills more
more
people
people
than
than
Hitler.
yeah,
Stalin,
he was a horrible person,
he is.
but so was.
He's actually, he's Ukrainian, he's not Russian.
Yes.
He starves Ukraine.
Just watched a movie.
Anywhere between 40 to 80 million Russians are killed under Stalin
And Lenin.
and Lenin, right? Right? You see the same thing with Mao under in China and the Cultural Revolution. But we teach our children, so just historically, what we did was is we taught our children the evils of Nazism. What happens is that, so Nazism, National Socialism, and communism are both a reaction to the globalization of Europe, by the way. They're both reactionary. Marx is writing against capitalists and their exploitation of people. Hitler is writing against, in Mein Kampf, against the Jews, which, by the way, how Hitler defines them, any communist is a Jew. Because it's a Jewish ideology. Because Marx was a Jew. Non-practicing atheistic Jew, but whatever. So National Socialism and Marxism, especially in Germany and in the West, are reactions to growing globalization of the world economy. And that because of industrialization, you can't have isolated, protected economies. You have to bring in raw material to manufacture it into whatever form you want, right? And so as England used up its sources of coal, it had to import coal, right? As it uses up its sources of iron, it has to import iron. So industrialization leads to globalization, and these two movements are in reaction to them. And if you read the original points, I think it's 25 points of the National Socialist Party, you will see things that sound very communistic in there, because it is a socialist movement. And people argue, so therefore it's a liberal movement. Now, here's the thing, by the time they get in power and they get the bankers behind them and things like that, they completely ignore all that socialism stuff, right? What do you mean we're not gonna charge interest? Yeah, we are. Yeah, right? And so they drop that really, really fast, once they become in power. So, what both the National Socialist does, though, in those socialist points is what we also see with communism and its lesser cousin socialism, which is to sit there and say, what they both kind of get right is that, again, because they're both Western, based off of Western philosophies, is that there is an inherent worth to man. And so that life has an inherent value. And so when we see it exploited by these people, whoever these people are, that is wrong and it must be corrected. So while communism is, I believe, the only still illegal political party to belong to in the United States, there were socialist or communist ideals that when people saw them, they said, well, yeah, all people are equal. We shouldn't exploit people. And that kind of gets brought in. Now, the other thing that because you're taking it from that source, you're taking in the other bad stuff, but we've trained people to be against Nazism. And we thought the Cold War was enough for people to be against communism. But the Nazis were dead. We didn't see people organizing for Nazis. I mean, there was the Illinois Nazis, right, which gets famously lampooned in Blues Brothers. There's that case of their right to march in the street. Nazis today, they still have to cover their identity, right? They go out because somebody's going to mess them up, because that is just, we're not going to tolerate that in the United States, right? Your parents, my grandparents, fought against the Nazis, okay? Shed their blood for that crap to not happen here. We didn't fight a shooting war with the USSR. And so we weren't geared for that. Plus, since they were still there, they could put out propaganda and things like that. And so we see in Europe, we see that it doesn't become communist, but it is much more socialized or socialism than we are. And that's because, one, they're not as isolated as well. And so people look at Europe, here in America, they look at Europe and they sit there and say, well, if that works there, that can work here. And again, it's trying to take the good from the bad, but you're always going to bring some of the bad with it. And so we get things like intersectionality. Well, at its heart, what we get is a mindset of, and this is what we're seeing playing out in culture today, is the oppressor-oppressed dynamic, where the oppressed is always right and the oppressor is always wrong. So, October 7th, Hamas is, you will see this, people say Hamas is completely justified because they are oppressed. And so they can go and they can kill as many Israeli citizens as they want because they are oppressed. Because by that person being an Israeli citizen, they are automatically part of the oppressor class, and so they get what's coming to them. Where this is hitting the road in our society, which should be addressed much, much more, and is much more alarming, but where it hits the road in our society is that our young men and our women, Gen Z and below. So Gen Z is raised in a world, don't mistake me, I don't want to sound like a conspiracist here, but Gen Z is raised in a world where it is evil to be a white male because you are the oppressor class. And so we have raised a generation of telling young men that they are evil by who they are, by their immutable traits. You can't change your skin color, right? Now, if you read the Augsburg Confession, an apology, who cares about race? That has no telling on right versus wrong. And so they've been told these things. We've seen also increasing isolation with them due to social media, so they don't interact with people very well. And social media brings out the worst of us, and because they're also juvenile, they seek out things that are juvenile, and so what do juveniles want to do? They want to say the things that you can't say, right? But what has happened is if I can't say this truth, that means the things that I really can't say must be more true. And so when they sit there and say, I'm not evil, and they're told, yes you are, you're white, you're male. Well, the truth is, they're not evil. I mean, they're sinners, right? I'm not saying that. But, you know, they would be what we call a good person, okay? Functioning person of society, whatever. And so, if they can't say that, then what happens is they gravitate more towards the other things that they can't say. And this is why, in Gen Z and below, we are seeing rising numbers of people that doubt the Holocaust. Because what's the one thing you can't say? The Holocaust didn't happen. So if I can't say that, and people react more aggressively when I say that, that must mean it is more true. And so you, because online anybody can say whatever the flip they want to say, you have idiots that are promoting this crap ideology because these young men are disaffected, alone, scared, and angry. And these men are coming along saying, well, that's not your fault, it's the world's fault. And this abhorrent ideology is actually true, and we need to promote this. Now, what happens on women is they gravitate more towards Marxist, liberal voices that are doing the same thing for them. So they're splitting from each other. And honestly, as a conservative church body, we were not prepared for this. As a conservative church body, we have punched left our entire existence. We left Prussia, we left Germany because of the Prussian Union. We said we're not going to kowtow to the government and teach doctrines that we believe are wrong. We're going to come to this place called America, which allows freedom of religion. Specifically why they came here was for freedom of religion. But what countries allow freedom of religion? Everybody else has a state church, except America. We're going to America. And they came here, and we can read Walther's writings. We can read their writings. They had no intention of integrating into American society. They were going to have a German Lutheran church that existed in America. It's their kids and their grandkids that sit there and say, we speak English now, we don't speak German. We are Americans, we are not Germans. Right? But still, it is a struggle until 1941 and Japan attacks Pearl Harbor. That is the moment we became an American church body and stopped being a German church body. Overnight. Yeah. So, where was I going on that? So our kids, but we've been punching left. We've been punching against liberalism. We went through the split in the starting in the 1950s, but finalizing in the 1970s, where were the only church body at the time, I think we still are, where the liberals left. The liberals have sit there and said the Bible isn't the Word of God, that Jesus maybe didn't exist, or Jesus isn't God. They left. And so as a conservative church body, we were completely and are still very much blindsided by this growing movement to our right, no longer dipping its toes, but openly admiring the Nazi government. Because what these voices have told them is that America is where the Weimar Republic was in the 1920s. And one of the things of the Weimar Republic was that it was a very licentious, liberal society. The first trans clinic was in the Weimar Republic, okay? And so they sit there and they tell these kids, well, what were the books the Nazis were burning? They were burning these sexual perversion books, and they were burning pornography and things like that. They conveniently leave out all the other stuff that the Nazis were burning, like Helen Keller's stuff, and they were burning, they burned a German poet's poetry who lived 100 years before Nazism because he promoted Christianity. And the Nazis are opposed to Christianity. And so these kids sit there and say, okay, I look out on the world, and every identity except mine gets affirmed. Right? You want to be a cat, trans, purple hair girl, even though you were born Billy, right? Oh, you get that affirmed. But me, who just is a straight white male that wants to play football, I'm the enemy of society. And so and not only that, a lot of them are addicted to pornography. So they view every woman as, I can say this because the kids aren't here, I'm going to say this a couple Sundays ago. They will literally say, all women are OnlyFans whores. Right? If you don't know what OnlyFans is, God bless you. Don't look it up, don't Google it, but it's a pornography website. It's not selling fans, it's selling pornography. And so they're bitter to society. These are our kids in our church because we're conservative as a church body. We are and so we weren't prepared for it in a lot of ways. And how you break these barriers down is you make relationships with them. You listen to them. We will hear the same statements, but because of where we grew up in history. So when we read that people who are homosexual, and in particular people who claim to be transsexual, have a higher suicide rate and higher suicide ideation. Well, we sit there and say, well, okay, we don't want those people to kill themselves, right? And so we're going to speak of homosexuality and transsexuality softer. And we're going to sit there and say, we need to try to understand these people. We need to try to reach them with the gospel and things like that. But if you grew up where every other identity is accepted except your own, and somebody comes to you and says, you can't say that, you need to be nicer to them. What you've just heard is, that person is valued and I'm not. And so you want to reject the ideology that leads to that. And so, again, at its heart, it's a sin problem. They're sinners, just as we are. They are more disconnected from the church because my generation is more disconnected from the church. They didn't grow up in the church. They've been told lies about what is effeminate and what is masculine, and so they buy into that bullshit. Again, excuse for the French, but that's what it is. If they actually read poetry, they would see some of the manliest men that they've ever could imagine wrote that poetry, right? But poetry is effeminate. Love is effeminate. Right? So I'm speaking about men. There's just this rejection of a lot of things. So part of it is a generation divide. And so breaking down those barriers, building those relationships, reaching them, showing them better ways, but also sitting there saying, just because you're white and straight doesn't mean you're evil. And as a church body, having to say that. Now, here's the thing. A church body says that in public today, that church body gets labeled as racist. Because of course, again, who are the bad guys? White, straight men, right? What's the problem with the American founders? They're all white, straight men, right? And so because they're evil, the United States government has to be evil, therefore defund the police. That's how that ideology goes. That's how you get to defund the police. Because it goes back to white, straight men, right? Everything is oppressed for suppressor ideology. And there's no recognition of, okay, what happens when the oppressed becomes the oppressor? They're not going to deal with that. They haven't had to deal with that. What we see with, again, with young women, they go the opposite way. They go much more liberal. Women will not date. Something like 75% of single women today will not date anybody who voted for Trump. Right off the bat. So again, they are more isolated, and those are the voices that they are listening to. And the voices that they are listening to, again, has that oppressor-oppressed dynamic. Now, the men are rejecting that dynamic, but the women are doubling down on that dynamic, and they are listening to more Marxist voices. At the heart of Marxism is atheism. And so while men will reject the church because it's not manly enough, all these boomer and millennial and Gen X leaders are too effeminate, women reject the church because the church is an object of oppression and has been used to oppress people. And so we're going to reject the church because we're going to reject a God that does that, and we will just live our life how we want to live. Who needs God? It's an atheistic mindset. And so they are going the, again, opposite direction. So I've talked a lot about young men because that's where I've done a lot of my research and a lot of my reading. But just the other side is what's happening with women. And how do we address that? We build relationships. They are still sinners. What both of these people need, what both groups need, what they're both missing, is Jesus Christ. Is Jesus Christ. They both recognize that they have a need, but they can't put it into words, and they're listening to false voices. So we're much more reflexive and easy to punch less because that's what we've been doing the whole time. Right? So a woman, a young woman, at every confirmation class, what do you mean women can't be pastors?
Well, that was clear back in my confirmation class.
I realize that, but you want to know who gets upset about that? It's not the boys. It's the girls in class. It's the girls in class when we go through it, right? What I try to counsel people when I get to talk to them about this is that both of those ideologies lead to loneliness, disconnectedness, despair, and anger. They will not take you to the land that they promise. Sometimes you're successful with that. Sometimes you're just planting the seed and hopefully somebody else down the road waters it. Who knows what 20 years is going to look like from now. When I was in my 20s, I didn't think we'd be dealing with Nazism anymore. So
the liberal thinking, the inclusion, gays are okay, abortion's okay if you want it, whatever, all this kind of thinking has led to
it's a reaction. It's a rejection of that. Because, for example, I have had discussions with people who are gay rights activists, and they will tell me that the gay rights trans flag is inclusive. I will ask them, what part represents straight? Well, no, not them. I'm one of them, right? So it's not inclusive, it's exclusive. It is excluding, honestly, 95% of the population. Only 5% of the population identifies as gay, lesbian, bisexual, transsexual, or other. Only 5%. And yet, they do have an outsized representation in media. They do have an outsized representation in society. And I'm not, by the way, I'm not saying we should kill them, we should stone them, or anything like that. Right? I honestly think it's very unhealthy that we are so obsessed with people's sexuality that has led people to make that the core of their identity. I don't go around and tell people I'm straight, right? The core of their identity is their sexuality. That's wrong, that's broken, right? So there's a reaction to that. And the other thing is that what both groups are doing, so I talked about this with the Nazis, how they kind of have a bait and switch, right? Oh, they were opposed to this, and then they'll lead them along to all the other crap. We saw this with BLM, Black Lives Matter. I think most people, if they heard that statement, devoid of what has happened, would sit there and say, well, yeah, why wouldn't they matter? They're people. Okay, what's going on, right? And so what had happened, though, is that because it's politicized, because there is a group called Black Lives Matter, and it is a subversive group, that people had to sit there and say, well, lowercase Black Lives Matter, not uppercase Black Lives Matter, not the organization. Why? Because the organization has, as part of their core identity, platform, who they are, the dissolution of the nuclear family. Because it is a Marxist organization. And Marxism has to destroy all authority outside of the government. This is what 1984, An Animal Farm. This is Orwell. This is what he warns against, right? So, yeah, Black Lives Matter. I can't say that because of the political context on a Sunday morning, right? And I cannot endorse the organization. I don't care how much good that they're doing, because at its core is something very, very evil. And so it's bait and switch with people. And people that don't know that about Black Lives Matter, when they hear you say, I'm opposed to Black Lives Matter, well, then you must be a racist, because that's the only reason that you could be opposed to Black Lives Matter, because they don't know the core ideology. And so there's a bait and switch that happens there, and they get repulsed by listening, because we are isolated and we are online and we listen. All we see is our algorithms, which feed us more of what we're willing to watch. And what are you willing to watch? By and large, that which makes you angry and that which makes you happy. So what comes across your Facebook page or your Instagram page or your Twitter, the For You part of Twitter, is either things that have made you happy and you spent time on, or things that made you mad and you spent time on. And there's a whole science of dopamine that's attached to this, and our brains are overflow. Our brains are not designed for the dopamine that we get from social media, by the way, which is just, it's ruining all sorts of things. So there's all sorts of symptoms and all sorts of causes, but at its core is just sin.
So why do these people wanna be angry because of what you were saying about the?
If I went through my early, if I was 18 and I've spent my whole life saying that I am not valued as a person because I'm white and straight, that's gonna lead me to anger. Right? Or if I went through my whole, 18 years old, and I've been told that I have been oppressed, but I can have the power to to overthrow my oppressors, that's going to make me angry. And both of those are going to eventually lead to violence.
But it all it's all centered with hate.
Yes.
Because, you know, blacks and Muslims.
So when you know, this is the most amazing thing for me is so some of these guys on the right, some of these young men on the right, they get attracted to the aesthetics of the church. They'll read the church fathers, they'll dive into church history, things like that. Part of it is this tied with Christian nationalism. We're tired of all this social morass that we see, so we're gonna burn it clean. We're gonna make the world new, which is just like, society isn't made right by morality. Moralism is the enemy of Christianity. Moralism is everybody's good and doesn't need Christ. Moralism does not save a country. Moralism does not make a country more righteous or unrighteous. Moralism just hides sin in different ways than what you're used to because you have a filter. Moralism is a filter, and you can change moralism. The Chinese have a different moralism than we do because they've been told a different filter, right? So moralism is antithetical to Christianity. And I will say that provocative statement. I truly believe that because moralism is not built on Christianity. Moralism is Christless religion in whatever form it is. So one of the amazing things, rounding back to the point, so when you read the church fathers, they will talk endlessly about love. Endlessly about love. And so when I talk with some of these young men, it's like, you said you read Augustine. But, I mean, did that part just go over your head? How did you ignore that, right? Augustine, he's your big hero. He's your big, action hero, could beat up the bad guys. And it is because, and we see this again in scriptures, the whole reason we have Romans chapter 1 Corinthians chapter 13, John and his letters, John 3:16, because Christianity is based upon love. Moralism is based upon hate. I hate these things, we're not going to allow them. The world is based on hate. The gods are angry, you have to appease the gods. At best, the gods are just indifferent, so you better make them happy. Christianity comes along and says, God loved you so much he died for you. And that changes it. Everything we've been going through here with Romans. I mean, this is what Paul has been explaining. Christ dying for us changes. It changes how we view society, how we view individuals, how we view right from wrong, good from evil, because when we know love, we know God. And when I say love, I don't mean the generic American English word of love. I mean Jesus Christ on the cross crucified for us. When we know God's love. And that, this is why the church fathers hammer on this, because they are living in a society just like us, which is built upon hate. A culture which is built upon hate. A culture which is built upon might makes right. What is subversive to that is love. Why do Christians get killed? Christians got killed by the Nazis because it's subversive, because it says, no, might does not make right. God is right, and we will listen to his word. And the Nazis said, if you're a faithful Christian, we're going to frickin' kill you. Why do the Romans kill the Christians? Same thing, right? There is, by the way, it is not a mistake that the Nazis said that they are the Third Reich. They were going back to Rome. They pulled so much of their imagery from the Romans, the eagle standards, things like that, right? And that demonic ideology of might makes right, men are in power, women. Look at what Nazis did to women, right? Women were supposed to be barefoot pregnant in the kitchen in Nazi Germany. They ended education for them, all sorts of stuff. What does Christianity say? In Christ there's neither male nor female. Love your wife as love your wife as Christ loved the church. Husbands, basically, I mean, there's a whole section. Husbands, treat your nice wife. Treat your nice wife. Wives, treat your husbands nice. Right? It's this. God makes Eve a helper, but what is Adam who names everything? He gives the label to everything, and God abides by it. What does Adam call Eve? Bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. Not a helper. Bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. Creation viewed under the lens of Christ is much more towards an egalitarian utopia than any society has ever existed. Now, it's not a complete egalitarian society, but the sexes can't be antagonistic towards each other. You can't be antagonistic towards somebody because they're Jewish or they're Greek or they're African. They're not like you. Just because somebody's Irish and I'm British, or I'm Scottish and they're English, or whatever it is, right? The dividing wall of hostility has been torn down. That's what the church fathers hammer, because it's the same things that have plagued society since the fall. We hate each other. Our natural disposition is to hate each other. You have to teach children how to express that hate. But children hate each other. Mine! I haven't played with that toy in 2 years. How dare you touch it? Right?
You're looking at me. Stop
Right.
looking at me.
Right? All we do, all society has done is said, okay, we're going to tell you who to hate and who to not hate. But you already know how to hate. That's sin. That's original sin. And the answer to that is Christ. So, the answer, what these youth need are not these idiots online. What they need is Christ. We have a job to do.
I'm gonna go kill myself now.
Please don't. Here's the thing: the church, right? What's the hymn? Even my steeples are falling, the bells shall ring, calling the young and old to rest. Church stands, and shall always stand. That is the promise of Jesus Christ, that the gates of hell shall not overcome it.
Seems like they are. Churches are
Well,
dwindling.
also realize that in America, in the West, it is declining. In the global South, the church is exploding. Right? So we get a myopic view because we look at the world around us and we sit there and say, oh my gosh, all this stuff is happening. It's growing in other places. And God uses sinners, right? We know this. God uses sinners. One of the things that these people, in particular on the right, have done is inadvertently, on purpose, but also they probably don't realize it, they are directing young men back to church. Now, they're directing them for the wrong reasons. But those young men are going to go to church, and what are they going to hear? They're going to hear Christ crucified. And it's going to be a diametrically opposed message than what those voices online are telling them. And there's going to have to become a breaking point for them. So, God uses sinners. He used Nebuchadnezzar. He used Sennacherib. He used a whole bunch of evil people. He used Herod. Right? God uses sinners. So, we have two choices. We can get discouraged. We can give up, pack up a roll, and go home. Or, right, and that's looking at the world as an obstacle. We can look at the world as opportunities. There has not been a greater time in the history of the United States, a more needful time in the history of the United States, to tell people about Jesus. That my neighbor is more than likely not already attached to a church. So I get to share Jesus with them. That's an opportunity. The Lord has placed us in a very much an Acts chapter 2 world. Let's get busy. What are they going to say? No? that gonna shut me up? No. Is that gonna stop me? No. Worst things anybody can tell you is no. Honestly, who cares?
And if they kill us, we go to heaven.
See, that's what the world always forgets. Okay, we are way over time. We did not get through chapter 13 like I thought.
It's a short chapter too.
It is. It is. Any other questions or comments or anything? Sorry if I made anybody mad. I apologize.
We'll finish 13 next Tuesday.
Yes.